Hey everyone, welcome back to Clark's Closer Look. I'm Marcel Clarke, and this week we're taking a closer look at our relationship with Ukraine and those tariffs that shook up world markets earlier this week. These two topics continue to evolve and change every single day, so we brought back former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State under the Obama administration, Joel Rubin, to help us better understand some of the moves this administration is taking. Joel Rubin, thank you so much for joining us today on this ongoing discussion that we're seeing overseas. Right now, though, Reuters is reporting the Trump administration and Ukraine plan to sign this much debated minerals deal. It's also reporting that Trump plans to do that in his address to Congress this evening. If this were to be signed, how would this salvage our relationship with Ukraine? And we go back to where we were before all of this?
It's been a really traumatic couple of weeks for the United States relationship with Ukraine and with our allies, alongside whom we've been supporting Ukraine for the last several years and longer than that, allies in NATO in particular. And, what President Trump and his team have done in the last couple of weeks is distance themselves and, by extension, the United States from Ukraine, going to, for example, the Munich Security Conference, where Vice President Vance spoke about essentially NATO countries and European democracies not really being democratic enough. And then he spoke with the leader of the proto-Nazi party, the AfD, in Germany, rather than the German chancellor. We had the defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, state overtly that NATO membership is off the table, giving up a concession to Russia without getting anything in return. That's been a multi-year ask by Russia regarding Ukraine. So, if this minerals deal goes forward, and it was going to go forward last Friday, but the president and President Zelensky had their moment. If it goes forward, fine, that's great. That'll help signal some kind of linkage between our two countries, but it won't be because of what happened on Friday. It was going to happen anyways on Friday. What happened on Friday was very traumatic, and I think really makes the rest of the world question the reliability of the United States as a partner. And don't forget, just last night, the president announced that he was going to pause military aid to Ukraine, a stab in the back of our ally directly when they're in the middle of a hot war. So I hope they move forward on that deal. But I got to tell you, substantively, just close with this, I'm disappointed that there is that kind of an arrangement between us and Ukraine. I think that we should have a bilateral agreement with Ukraine on minerals, maybe right of first refusal, or the country that can get the concession, but we should not be extorting their moment of being under duress to obtain rights to half their minerals. And if anyone should be paying for the cost of this war, it should be Russia and their assets, not the Ukrainian assets.
Yeah, and a lot of people were going back and forth on how this would impact Ukraine when you mentioned that the US halted its military aid to Ukraine a couple of hours ago. If, let's say, this deal were not to go through this evening, how long could Ukraine continue to fight this war with Russia?
Well, goodness, assuming that everything stays as it currently is, and if there's no change in the posture of Russia and sort of their planning, well, which is not likely, estimates are that Ukraine might be able to get a few months of fighting in without completely collapsing. And then in that time, hopefully, Britain and others could provide the kind of munitions supply that's needed. But there's really no replacement, no military replacement for the United States of America. Our not just our hardware, but also our intelligence support, our planning support. These are integral to Ukraine's ability to defend itself. And I want to point out to the listeners as well why this matters. Ukraine is just one country with whom we have a bilateral relationship of military to military cooperation that is deep and comprehensive. But there are many countries around the world that look to the United States for security guarantees. And security guarantees is an issue that President Zelensky brought up. And what does that mean? It means that the United States is going to be there as a backstop if you are threatened. That may not mean the United States goes to war on your behalf, but that it will provide the kinds of military support, like in the case of Ukraine or in the case of Israel, that helps them defend themselves. And we have relationships that are grounded in security guarantees with dozens of countries around the world. NATO is the most well-known alliance, but you name it. We have it with Israel. We have it with Taiwan. We have it with Egypt. We have it in countries all around the world. And every country right now is looking around, and they're having these meetings, and they're thinking, how dependable are those security guarantees from the United States?
We have to talk about Russia here because there was an interview that stood out to me. I don't know if you got the chance to see it, but in an interview with ABC News on Sunday, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said, quote, "We're trying to get the man to the table, the Russians. And I've said from the very beginning, maybe they don't want a deal either. We don't know, but we haven't talked to them in 3 years, but maybe they do," end quote. So is this correct? I was shocked to hear that they haven't talked to him in 3 years. What have the conversations been with Russia?
Well, we, the United States, under President Biden, didn't hold bilateral summits with Vladimir Putin after he invaded. Remember, on the eve of the invasion, then Vice President Harris, met in Europe, met in Munich, and met with Zelensky. And we had engagements with Putin and with his team in days prior, including the CIA director, Bill Burns, and the president also called and said, "Don't do this." And he did it. But other countries have been talking to Russia throughout. European countries have been engaging, dealing with him. And the reason the conversations have not moved forward isn't because of a lack of interest in diplomacy by the United States. It's because Vladimir Putin has not felt compelled to come to the table. And so I think, to their credit, what the Trump team is trying to do is to find a diplomatic endgame, to find some solution to end this war. But what they're doing is they're not being collaborative with our allies. They're not being collaborative with Ukraine, the two most important partners of the United States in this. And what they're doing is they're making preemptive concessions to Russia in public that are eliminating leverage that we have and will need in a negotiation. And it's now become, and what it looks like is, an America-Russia negotiation over American-Russian relations. And whatever happens with Ukraine, we'll just force it on them. As opposed to the United States is a real mediator, think Camp David, where the United States and Jimmy Carter got in between the president of Egypt and the prime minister of Israel and sat with them, and they hammered out a deal. And the United States guaranteed that deal through military aid that continues to this day. When it comes to Russia, it's fine and important to talk to the Russians, but why are we giving up concessions ahead of time? And why are we not doing it in coordination with our allies as opposed to in opposition and chastisement of our allies?
Going more into this Minerals Act, I feel like there's so many questions revolving that. And with all
Yeah,
the
like first is that Ukraine doesn't even have control of those minerals, but that's beside the point. Sorry.
But there's so much information that I feel viewers do not know. And also the war damage. We're seeing a lot of war damage here with Ukraine. They've been fighting this battle for 3 years, more than 3 years now. The point here is that there will need to be significant build out for mineral production to start in order for this, if this were to be signed. How does this exchange look like moving forward? And does this include American boots on the ground? What would this signal with this act?
Well, the answer is that none of the details are clear.
Okay.
The idea here, in theory, is that once the war is over, that area, the Donbass, which is in the eastern part of Ukraine, currently controlled by Russia primarily, that area can become open to mining, and that the mining, right, the revenues obtained, I believe, the way I understand it, is they will then be put into a fund or into a big pot of money that we could have 50% of, and that's the idea, that it would basically be a long-term project. And now, the problem with this, and I hate to sound cynical, but that goes with the business, right? Is cynicism and national security. But there are like $2 trillion worth of minerals in Afghanistan.
Okay.
And we were talking about that for years. You know what? There's still $2 trillion worth of minerals in Afghanistan, because getting them out, to your question, is not an overnight endeavor. There are more minerals, more precious metals, more high value minerals in Canada than there are in Ukraine. And it turns out Canada is next door and safe and peaceful. But no, we're going to tariff Canada and start a trade war with them, and not get those minerals. So getting the land secured, the investment in, having them pulled out, having them be made productive enough to then be converted into sales, that's a 10, 15, 20-year process.
It's a long way.
It's not like it's all going to just go back into the treasury to cover the costs, but it is, and I'll add this, and this is again another cynical sounding point, but I'm going to say this. Yes, it's true that it would bind the United States and Ukraine together economically or commercially. There would be more ties, but the fallacy here in terms of how it's being pitched by the administration is that this is somehow going to guarantee security for Ukraine. No, it's not. It's an economic agreement. And if Russia were to, in the future, invade Ukraine and take those minerals, they could call up the White House and say, hey, guess what? We're about to take Ukraine, but you know what? That minerals deal, we're going to stand by it. So don't worry. You're going to have the same deal anyways.
Wow.
And nothing will preclude that from happening. And so there's no security guarantee inherent in a good commercial deal.
So, Joel, just final thoughts when it comes to what's taking place overseas. What's it going to take to get Putin on the table to maybe potentially agree to a ceasefire?
Well, it's intriguing because Volodymyr Zelensky today, Ukraine's president, pitched an idea of a ceasefire, an immediate ceasefire, no more strikes into Russia, maritime ceasefire. He's for it. And sort of like calling Putin's bluff. Trump says he wants a ceasefire. The Trump team has been saying that they've been putting pressure on Zelensky because for some reason he doesn't seem to want to stop the war. Never mind the fact that they don't make it clear that the war is on Ukraine's territory because Russia is the one conducting the war. But to get Putin to stop, to pull back, to do a temporary ceasefire, I think Putin's going to want more. I think he's going to want the United States to really make hard concessions. And I don't think he's going to want to come to the table with Zelensky. And that's going to be the biggest challenge.
Are you talking about Trump or Putin? Putin, okay.
I think that Putin will want to only negotiate with Trump. The whole challenge here, and this has been one of the hardest nuts to crack in the policy community about how to do diplomacy, which is that Putin has been trying for the last several years to make it a Putin-American negotiation over the future of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And the Biden team said, no negotiation, no deal about Ukraine without Ukraine. So it's the U.S. and Ukraine together. And that's kept it at loggerheads. Trump has made the decision, I believe, to put pressure on Ukraine to then negotiate for the United States with Russia alone, which plays into Putin's hands, really to the detriment of Ukraine. And, if you want a long war to end, and this is a 10-year war that's now in a very intense phase of the last 3 years, you're going to have the Ukrainians feel like they are bought into it. And I don't think that Putin sees in his interest to have a bilateral negotiation with Ukraine. He still feels he has the upper hand. He wants concessions from the United States. He wants sanctions from the United States lifted. He wants us to stop doing counter cyber and espionage. He wants us to pull back from different bases and weaken NATO. This is a big game strategy for Putin. It's about cleaving off the United States from our global leadership. That's what he's trying to leverage. And that's where Biden wouldn't go. And that's where he said, I'm standing with Ukraine. And the risk here is that Trump's so desperate to get this done and chasing Putin so much that he's willing to do that negotiation, leave Ukraine to the side, and potentially trade off major strategic advantages that the United States has over Russia.
Joel, changing our topic to tariffs, another big talker for Tuesday. We're seeing the world markets shake up. American consumers are afraid that they're going to see less money in their bank accounts. But what's the bigger picture here? What are these tariffs going to do to essentially protect Americans?
Well, that's the big unknown because tariffs tend to create harsher dynamics for Americans rather than better dynamics. And here's the issue, putting on a public policy hat. When there is a problem that needs to be resolved, immigration flows over the border, fentanyl flows over the border. Typically, when you get really excited about this, typically when one wants to resolve it, they use tools to resolve that, right? Okay. But tariffs are like this broad macroeconomic instrument that affects sectors of the economy that literally have nothing to do with fentanyl interdiction or the flow of refugees and migrants over the border, right? So why don't you come up with better bilateral agreements with the Mexicans and the Canadians on fentanyl, better AI, better border security. Why don't you come up with programs to help development in Mexico, which of course is going to get screwed up now by the evisceration of our foreign aid programs? You know, a decade ago, I went on a CODEL, which is a congressional delegation. When I was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs at the State Department, I went with 7 members of Congress, bipartisan members of House Foreign Affairs Committee, and we went to DFA, we went to Mexico City, and we visited projects that USAID was paying for to help people improve their lives, be it people who were put in prison for drug sales, people were selling cocaine. I mean, there was a lot of interdiction issues, a lot of programs that we were supporting that were helping people to want to build a better life there in Mexico and not come north. So why not focus on that? Instead, we do these tariffs that are basically going to bankrupt farmers. They're going to raise the price for consumers. They're going to jack up automobile costs, some estimates up to $12,000 per car. How does that improve the situation at the border? It doesn't. So what the president is trying to do is come in with a hammer. Like there's that saying, right? When you have a hammer, every problem seems like a nail. And so he's just hammering away.
Yeah.
And I think that the goal here is for them to put pressure enough on Canada and Mexico that they will negotiate a better deal somehow, somewhere. But we're all caught in the crossfire, and we're all going to have to pay the bills, higher bills, for a very inexact policy.
And you mentioned this key part here, which is the war on fentanyl. Part of this whole thing is
Mm-hmm.
to fight this ongoing war that we've seen. But
As we should be.
yeah, there are two parts to this issue, though, which includes, like you mentioned, the production and mainly coming from Mexico and also the consumption, which tends to be here in the United States. But
Yes.
we recently saw the Trump administration label drug cartels as terrorists. So why can't we see, like you mentioned, a little bit more of a direct approach, working alongside the Mexican government,
Mm-hmm.
tackling these labs, since we now have that label to the drug cartels? Why aren't we seeing something more on that end?
Yeah, I do applaud the administration for designating the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, FTOs. They're not directly like the classic FTO when you think of Al Qaeda or Hamas, a foreign terrorist organization that conducts attacks that kill Americans, for example. But they're killing Americans with what they produce. They're destroying the state of Mexico, the nation of Mexico. I think that this opens up a lot of tools in the toolkit from an American foreign policy perspective related to sanctions, related to law enforcement, related to military support. There's no reason we can't be embedding and in and working alongside Mexican forces inside Mexico to take on these groups. And you're right, that is what should be thought about. I worry. I'm not sure it's going to go there, but I worry about the tone and the language of the administration towards Mexico. The language is sort of like stating, well, the government of Mexico is in bed with the cartels, which is a smear and also leads you into a slippery slope of state-sponsored terrorism, where you have a country like Iran, which is a state sponsor of terrorism. They support Hezbollah, which conducts terrorist attacks, and they are therefore targeted in that way. And so in foreign policy, state sponsors of terrorism get sanctioned and targeted. And so it's an imprecise way to go about it. Makes me nervous that it brings up the specter of American military apparatus unilaterally dealing with Mexico, which of course, as you know, historically brings up a lot of nationalism in Mexico and a lot of anger at the United States. We need to find a way to partner with the government of Mexico to eradicate the drug trade. And one other thing I should mention, which I'm not sure if you're tracking this, but there's a case now, I believe at the Supreme Court, where Mexican, I believe it's a Mexican organization, is suing United States gun manufacturers for exporting guns at a high rate into Mexico. That's a big ask. They ask us for things too, and that's part of the diplomatic dynamic. It's very hard for us to counter American guns for many constitutional reasons, but I do think this FTO designation is a very valuable tool, but it needs to be handled very carefully.
Okay. Final thoughts, Joel. We've seen the retaliation already with these tariffs from China and Canada. We're still waiting for Mexico's president, Claudia Sheinbaum's response, which we're hearing maybe later on this week or come Sunday. What can
Hmm.
we expect?
Well, if it continues the way it is, and there's no change between now and the Scheinbaum speech, she announced she's going to do it in the Zocalo, which is the big square in Mexico City, and 1 million people can come in there. And I could easily envision a moment where she gets out there and rallies the crowd from a nationalist perspective to say, we are not going to we are not going to cower under this kind of pressure, and makes it a very strong national rallying cry. And, that's not in anyone's long term interest, but there's no reason to think she wouldn't do it, because she needs to rally her country right now, because they are now going to be under economic duress. But it's a very dangerous dynamic for the United States, because we have such an intertwined economy with
Yeah.
Mexico, both from NAFTA and then from the trade agreement that President Trump negotiated in his first term. Our economies are so intertwined, and our peoples are so intertwined, that making these kinds of aggressive actions that harm the economies and people's pocketbooks
Mm.
doesn't lead to the kinds of outcomes that make people feel like they are respected, and that frankly get to the root issues. I just say, if we want to stop migration heading north, we have to work with the Mexican government to tamp down on it, and to build up Mexico as a country, and to find that as a partnership opportunity. We're going the opposite direction, and we're putting pressure on Mexico in ways that could very much have a negative reverberation on us here at home.
Definitely lots of ongoing news, and we'll see what unfolds this week. But Joel Rubin, as always, thank you so much for helping us out with this topic and for your time. Definitely.
My pleasure. Thanks, Marcel.